The night was cold, and the streets were almost empty. A homeless man sat on the sidewalk, wrapped in an old, worn-out army jacket. His hands were rough, his face covered in a thick beard, and his eyes, dark and unreadable, stared at the ground. His name was Jacob, but no one cared to ask. To most people, he was just another forgotten soul, another invisible man lost in the city's shadows. Two police officers, Ryan and Mark, walked down the street, their boots tapping against the pavement. They were bored. Nothing exciting ever happened in this part of town. As they passed by, Ryan noticed Jacob sitting near a store entrance. He smirked and nudged Mark. "Look at this guy," Ryan muttered. "Probably hasn't showered in months." Mark chuckled. "Think he even knows where he is?" Ryan stepped closer, looking down at Jacob with amusement. "Hey, old man. No loitering here. Move along." Jacob didn't react. He remained still, his fingers lightly tapping against a dented metal can beside him. A few coins lay inside, barely enough for a meal. Ryan didn't like being ignored. He took a step forward and kicked the can, sending the coins scattering across the sidewalk. The clinking sound echoed in the silent street. Jacob slowly lifted his eyes, his expression calm, almost too calm. "Didn't you hear me?" Ryan said, crossing his arms. "I said move along." A woman passing by glanced at the scene and shook her head. She didn't stop, but before walking away, she muttered, "You don't know who you're messing with." Mark laughed. "Oh yeah? And who exactly are we messing with? Some drunk who lost his way." Jacob said nothing. He simply picked up the can, placed it beside him, and leaned back against the wall, completely unfazed. Ryan frowned. He didn't like this. Most homeless people would get nervous, apologize, maybe even beg. But this man, he was different. There was something unsettling about his silence, about the way he barely reacted. It was like he had seen much worse things before. Mark took a step closer, looking at Jacob's jacket. It was old and faded, but the military patches were still visible. He reached down and grabbed Jacob's dog tags, squinting at the worn-out text. "Where'd you get this?" Mark asked. "Stole it from a real soldier." Jacob's hand twitched, just for a second, but he still didn't speak. Ryan smirked. "That's cute. You playing soldier now? Maybe we should take you in, clean you up, see if there's a real person under all that filth." A teenage boy, leaning against a lamppost nearby, watched the scene unfold. His arms were crossed, and a small smirk played on his lips. "That's a mistake," he muttered under his breath. The officers didn't hear him. Ryan decided he had enough. "Come on, Mark. This guy's a waste of time." But before he could turn away, Jacob finally moved. He reached into his jacket, pulling something out, slowly, carefully. Both officers tensed, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. But Jacob didn't pull out a knife or a gun. Instead, he revealed a small, crumpled photograph. He held it up for just a second before tucking it away again. But in that brief moment, Mark caught a glimpse of the image. A younger version of Jacob, dressed in full military gear, standing beside a group of men. The kind of men you didn't mess with. Mark's stomach twisted. Something about that photo sent a chill down his spine. He glanced at Ryan, who was still smirking, unaware of the shift in the air. Jacob finally spoke, his voice deep and calm. "You ever hear about the ghost sniper?" Ryan snorted. "What, some movie character?" A new voice cut through the air. "You idiots." The officers turned, surprised. An older man, sitting outside a nearby cafe, had been watching them. His hand shook as he set down his coffee and stood up, his eyes locked onto Jacob. Ryan frowned. "And who the hell are you?" The man ignored him. He stepped closer to Jacob, his expression filled with something between fear and awe. "It's you," he whispered. "Jacob Reeves." Mark felt his pulse quicken. "Wait, what?" The cafe man swallowed hard, his hands still trembling. You're standing in front of the deadliest sniper in Green Beret history. A heavy silence filled the street. Ryan's smirk faded. Mark's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The teenage boy by the lamppost chuckled, shaking his head. "Told you," he muttered. Jacob leaned back against the wall, a small smirk forming on his lips. But this time, it wasn't a friendly one. It was the kind of smirk that made the air feel colder, the kind that signaled the game had changed. Ryan took a step back, his mouth suddenly dry. "No way. This guy's homeless." The cafe man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "And yet, he could take both of you down before you even blink." Jacob said nothing. He simply watched, waiting. The night air grew heavier. For the first time, the officers felt something they hadn't expected. Doubt. And maybe fear. The streetlights flickered as a cold wind swept through the quiet city. Ryan and Mark stood frozen, their confident smirks now replaced with uncertainty. The old man from the cafe kept staring at Jacob, his eyes filled with something the officers couldn't quite place. Was it respect? Fear? Both. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. "You're messing with us, old man," he said, forcing a chuckle. "There's no way this guy is some legendary soldier." The old man didn't look away from Jacob. His voice was firm. "Look him up. Jacob Reeves. Green Beret sniper. You'll find classified missions, records that suddenly stop. Because men like him don't retire. They just disappear." Mark hesitated. His fingers twitched as he reached for his phone. His gut told him not to, but curiosity won. As he typed the name, Ryan scoffed and turned back to Jacob. "Even if you were some big-shot soldier, look at you now. Sitting on the sidewalk like the rest of them. Must not have been that great if this is where you ended up," Ryan muttered. Jacob remained silent, his expression unreadable. But something flickered in his dark eyes, just for a second. A shadow of something deeper, something dangerous. Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, and the blood drained from his face. His hands trembled slightly as he read. "Ryan." His voice came out quieter than he expected. Ryan turned. "What?" Mark swallowed hard. "It's true." He slowly lifted the phone, showing the screen. There it was. Jacob Reeves, former Green Beret, known as the Ghost Sniper. Over 200 confirmed kills, highly classified missions, and then, suddenly, nothing. His military record stopped abruptly. Ryan's cocky smirk vanished. He looked at Jacob again, but this time, he saw him differently. Not as a homeless man, not as some nobody sitting on the street, but as a trained killer who had lived through things they couldn't even imagine. The cafe man exhaled. "You two don't realize how close you are to making the worst mistake of your lives." Ryan took a small step back. Mark's grip tightened on his phone. The cold wind felt even colder now. Jacob finally moved. Slowly, he reached for his can, picking it up and placing it neatly beside him again. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, calm, but it carried a weight that made the officers feel like they were standing in front of something far bigger than they could handle. "You boys think power comes from a badge," Jacob said, his gaze locking onto them. "It doesn't." Silence. Heavy, thick silence. Ryan felt something deep in his chest. An instinct, a warning. He suddenly wished they had just kept walking. "You said." Mark's fingers tightened around his phone as he kept staring at the screen. The more he scrolled, the worse it got. Every article, every record pointed to the same terrifying truth. Jacob Reeves wasn't just a soldier. He was a legend. A ghost. The kind of man people whispered about in war zones. The kind of man whose name was spoken with fear. Ryan took another step back, but he forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the strange tension hanging in the air. "All right, so what? Maybe he was some big-shot sniper. That was a long time ago. Look at him now. He's just some washed-up old man." Jacob didn't react. He didn't even blink. His stillness was more unsettling than any outburst ever could have been. It was the kind of stillness that made the air feel heavier, the kind that made Mark's stomach twist with unease. The old man from the cafe exhaled sharply. "You don't get it, do you?" He turned to Ryan. "Men like him don't just forget how to fight. They don't get weaker. They get deadlier." Ryan scoffed, but there was no confidence in it this time. Deadlier. Look at him. He can barely stand. For the first time, Jacob smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down the spine, the kind that made Mark instinctively take a step back before he even realized what he was doing. "You think you're in control here," Jacob said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You're not." Ryan's jaw clenched. He hated the way this man made him feel. Small, powerless. He wasn't used to that. He was the one with the badge, the gun, the authority. He was supposed to be the one in control. "You're just some homeless guy sitting on a sidewalk," Ryan snapped, trying to regain control of the situation. "You have nothing." Jacob slowly tilted his head, studying Ryan like a predator sizing up its prey. "You really believe that?" Mark swallowed hard. He wanted to leave. Every instinct in his body told him they had pushed too far, that they were standing on dangerous ground. The cafe man took a deep breath. "Boys, listen to me. If Jacob wanted to, you'd both be on the ground before you even touched your weapons." Ryan glared at him. "You really think he's that dangerous?" Jacob sighed, as if he was already bored of the conversation. Then, in a single motion, he moved. Before Mark or Ryan could react, Jacob's hand snapped forward and grabbed Ryan's baton straight from his belt. In less than a second, he flipped it in his hand, twirling it with the kind of precision that only came from years of training. Ryan's hand flew to his holster, but before he could even touch his gun, Jacob was already behind him, twisting his arm. Ryan let out a sharp gasp, his body frozen in place. He didn't even see Jacob move. It was too fast, too smooth. Mark's hand hovered over his own weapon, but the cafe man shouted, "Don't." Jacob's voice was calm as ever. "Don't do it, kid." Mark didn't move. He couldn't. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Ryan, completely at Jacob's mercy. Then, just as quickly as it happened, Jacob let go. Ryan stumbled forward, his breath shaky, his face pale. He turned, eyes wide, looking at Jacob like he was seeing him for the first time. Jacob tossed the baton at Ryan's feet. "Power doesn't come from a badge," he said quietly. "It comes from knowing when to use it, and when not to." Mark exhaled, finally understanding what the cafe man had been trying to tell them all along. Ryan, still catching his breath, didn't say a word. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. The street felt eerily silent after what had just happened. Ryan's breath was uneven, his heart pounding as he stared at Jacob. He wanted to say something, wanted to yell, wanted to push back, but he couldn't. His body wouldn't move the way he wanted. His mind was trying to process what had just happened, but it was too fast, too precise, too effortless. Mark stood frozen, his hand hovering near his gun, but not daring to pull it. He had just witnessed something terrifying, something that went beyond simple training. This wasn't just an old soldier defending himself. This was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of war, a man whose instincts were sharper than any weapon. Jacob sat back down against the wall like nothing had happened. His expression was calm, his movements slow and controlled. He didn't look like a man who had just disarmed an officer in seconds. He looked bored. The cafe man shook his head and sighed. "You boys are lucky." His voice was heavy with experience, with understanding. "If he wanted to, you wouldn't be standing right now." Ryan clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath his fear. "You're saying he could have killed us?" His voice was shaky, no longer filled with the arrogance it had before. Jacob smirked, but there was no humor in it. "If I wanted to," he said simply. Mark swallowed hard. He believed him. Every part of him believed him. The teenage boy leaning against the lamppost let out a low whistle. "Dan," he muttered, "you guys really messed up." Ryan shot him a glare, but even that felt weak. His entire body still tingled with adrenaline, his nerves on edge. He had never felt this way before. Not in training, not on the streets, not even in the most dangerous parts of town. This was different. This was something primal. Jacob leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto Ryan's. "You were so sure I was weak," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Because I'm homeless. Because I look like I have nothing." Ryan's mouth was dry. He didn't respond. Jacob's gaze didn't waver. "You judge people by what you see on the surface. That's a mistake." The cafe man nodded. "A deadly one." Ryan and Mark stood there, completely out of words. The weight of their mistake pressed down on them, suffocating, inescapable. Jacob exhaled, glancing at the sky. "I've seen men like you before," he said. "Men who think power comes from a uniform, a badge, a gun." He looked back at them, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It doesn't." Mark finally found his voice. "Then what does?" Jacob studied him for a moment before replying. "Understanding." Ryan and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. The answer was simple, but it carried a depth they weren't sure they could fully grasp. Jacob reached for his can and set it neatly beside him again, as if the whole encounter had never happened. The air remained thick with tension. Mark finally spoke, his voice quieter this time. Who are you?" Jacob let out a small, almost tired chuckle. "Someone you weren't ready to meet." A long silence followed. The officers didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. For the first time, Ryan wished they had just kept walking. "You said." The street felt colder now, the weight of the moment pressing down on Ryan and Mark. Neither of them spoke, neither of them moved. Everything had shifted. They had started this encounter believing they held power, believing they were in control. But now, standing before Jacob Reeves, they realized the truth. They never had control. Ryan clenched his jaw, trying to push back the feeling of unease crawling up his spine. He had faced criminals before. He had dealt with violent men, desperate men. But this was different. Jacob wasn't desperate. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He was something else entirely, something Ryan didn't know how to handle. The cafe man shook his head and muttered, "Damn fools." He took a sip of his coffee, his hand still slightly trembling. "You think men like him end up here because they failed?" He let out a dry laugh. "You have no idea what kind of world you just stepped into." Ryan hated feeling small. He hated feeling outmatched. If he's so dangerous, why is he here? Sitting on the street like this. His voice was defensive, but even he could hear the weakness in it. Jacob exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if warming them against the cold. "You think I lost everything, don't you?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment before shaking his head. "I didn't lose anything. I walked away." Mark frowned. "Why?" Jacob glanced at him, studying him carefully. "Because some wars never end. You just choose whether or not you want to keep fighting them." Ryan scoffed, but it was weaker than before. "So what? You just gave up." Jacob chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "If I had given up, you wouldn't be standing here." Mark's stomach twisted. He knew what Jacob meant. If this man had truly lost control, if he had chosen violence instead of patience, they wouldn't be having this conversation. The cafe man leaned forward. "You boys ever hear the story about the lion and the hunter?" Ryan barely glanced at him. "What?" The old man smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "The lion doesn't attack because it's weak. It doesn't attack because it's afraid. It watches, it waits, and if you push too hard, the hunter becomes the hunted." Ryan swallowed hard. Jacob stretched his arms, then leaned back against the wall again, closing his eyes as if this whole conversation had already bored him. "You can go now," he said. "I'm done teaching for the night." It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. Mark grabbed Ryan's arm. "Come on," he said under his breath. Ryan didn't move at first. His pride was screaming at him to say something, to take control back. But deep down, he knew there was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. Without another word, the two officers turned and walked away. The teenage boy at the lamppost let out a low chuckle. "Damn," he muttered. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." Jacob didn't react. He simply sat there, the same as before. To anyone passing by, he was just another homeless man on the street. But now, two officers knew the truth, and they would never forget it. "You said." Ryan and Mark walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. The city noises around them felt distant, like they were underwater. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of what had just happened sat heavy between them. Ryan's hands were still shaking. He clenched them into fists, trying to steady himself, but the adrenaline still hadn't worn off. His heart pounded in his chest, not from anger, but from something else, something he didn't want to admit. Fear. Mark finally broke the silence. "What just happened back there?" His voice was quiet, like he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Ryan let out a shaky breath. "I don't know." But that was a lie. He did know. He just didn't want to accept it. Jacob Reeves wasn't just some washed-up soldier. He was something else. Something beyond them. Ryan had been in plenty of tough situations before, but never had he felt so powerless. It wasn't just Jacob's speed, his skill, or the way he moved. It was the way he looked at them, like he had already won before they even knew they were in a fight. Mark stopped walking. He turned to Ryan, his face pale. "You realize he let us go, right?" Ryan's stomach twisted. He did realize it. If Jacob had wanted to, he could have left them both lying in the street, broken, humiliated, or worse. And the terrifying part, they never would have seen it coming. Mark rubbed his face, exhaling slowly. "I looked him up, Ryan, before we left." Ryan stiffened. "And?" Mark hesitated. "Half his records are sealed. The stuff I did find." He swallowed. He wasn't just a sniper. He was the best. They called him the Ghost because he never missed. His missions, most of them don't even exist in official reports. Ryan stayed quiet. Mark looked back toward the alley, where Jacob still sat, unmoving. "That guy isn't just dangerous, Ryan. He's something else entirely." Ryan didn't respond. He couldn't. He had spent years thinking his badge made him powerful, that his authority meant something. But tonight, he had learned a hard truth. Real power wasn't about a uniform. It wasn't about weapons or rank. Real power was sitting back there, on that cold sidewalk, in the form of a man who had walked away from war, but had never truly left it. And Ryan knew, deep in his bones, that he never wanted to be on the wrong side of that man again. "You said." Ryan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jacob Reeves sitting there, calm, unreadable, dangerous. No matter how much he tried to push the memory away, it kept creeping back. The way Jacob moved, the way he disarmed him without effort, the way he spoke, as if he had already measured them and found them insignificant. By morning, Ryan felt like he was carrying a weight he didn't understand. His pride told him to forget it, to brush it off as just another bad night on the job. But deep down, he knew better. Mark had already beaten him to the station, sitting at his desk with his phone in hand. He looked up when Ryan walked in, his expression serious. "You're not gonna believe this." Ryan sat down across from him, rubbing the exhaustion from his face. "What now?" Mark slid his phone across the desk. "Someone left a tip last night. A crime boss we've been after for months. He's in the city. Word is, he's looking for someone." Ryan frowned, picking up the phone. The message was short, but clear. "Mason Carter is back. He's hunting the ghost sniper. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Jacob. Mark nodded. I did some digging. Carter used to be a weapons dealer overseas. Had a crew, worked for some real dangerous people. The last time anyone saw him, he was in a war zone. And guess who was sent in to take him down? Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. Jacob. Yeah, Mark said. Only Carter got away. And now, years later, he's back. And he's looking for revenge. Ryan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Last night, they had thought Jacob was just another homeless man with a past. But now, it was clear, he wasn't just surviving on the streets. He was hiding. Or maybe, waiting. Mark exhaled. Ryan, what if we just walked away from the most dangerous man in the city? And what if the only thing keeping that danger in check is him? Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure which side of the law he wanted to be on.